Hi guys, today we are going to find out, what if the Capitol riot never occurred on January 6th, 2021? You're standing in the marble corridors of the US Capitol on a crisp winter morning, watching senators and representatives file in for what should be a routine electoral certification. The air hums with typical political tension, but there's no scent of tear gas, no sound of breaking glass echoing through these hallowed halls. You probably won't survive the mind-bending implications of how differently American democracy could have unfolded in this timeline. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment below with your location and local time. I'm curious where in the world you're contemplating alternate histories right now. Now, sit back and let's dive into today's alternate journey together. You watch as Capitol police officers patrol with their standard Wednesday afternoon vigilance, unaware they're living through a timeline where democracy's stress test never quite reaches its breaking point. The metal detectors beep routinely as lawmakers pass through, their biggest concern being whether they remembered their morning coffee. Outside, a few hundred protesters gather with signs and chants, but the crowds remain manageable, contained within the designated areas by temporary barriers. Vice President Mike Pence arrives at his office, reviewing the ceremonial script he'll follow, unaware that in another timeline, this day would define his entire political legacy. You sense the weight of what's about to unfold, or rather, what's about to not unfold, as democracy takes a different path entirely. You find yourself in Trump's private quarters at the White House, watching him pace restlessly as his advisors present him with a choice that will define history. The morning light streams through bulletproof windows as his legal team delivers their final assessment. The electoral challenges have reached their constitutional limits. You witness something unprecedented, Trump pausing mid-tweet, his thumb hovering over the send button that would have unleashed his most inflammatory message yet. Instead, he sets the phone down and turns to face the cameras, being prepared for what becomes the most surprising speech of his presidency. "My fellow Americans," he begins, and you realize you're watching a man choosing legacy over litigation, reputation over rebellion. The words that follow reshape everything. While I disagree with many aspects of this election, I recognize that our constitutional process has concluded. You observe his closest advisors' shocked expressions as he announces his intention to attend Biden's inauguration, breaking decades of precedent in the opposite direction. The speech lasts only 12 minutes, but you understand you're witnessing a moment when personal political calculation trumps populist fury. Social media algorithms, designed to amplify outrage, suddenly find themselves processing messages of reluctant acceptance rather than calls for resistance. You watch as the narrative shifts in real time. Instead of "stop the steal," trending hashtags begin reflecting constitutional process and peaceful transition. Trump's decision creates a ripple effect through his most ardent supporters, many of whom begin questioning their travel plans to Washington. The buses that would have carried protesters to the Capitol receive cancellation calls throughout the morning as the movement's energy dissipates. You stand beside Mike Pence as he enters the Senate chamber, unaware that he's about to experience the most anticlimactic day of his vice presidency. The gallery fills with the usual mix of lawmakers, staff, and observers, their conversations reflecting typical political tensions rather than existential dread. You watch as Pence reviews his ceremonial duties one final time, the constitutional language feeling routine rather than revolutionary. The wooden gavel feels normal in his hands as he calls the joint session to order at precisely 1 p.m. State by state, the electoral votes are read aloud, and you notice how the process moves with surprising efficiency. When Arizona's results are announced, you observe a few Republican objections, but they follow proper parliamentary procedure without theatrics. Pence navigates these challenges with the steady demeanor that defined his political career, neither hero nor villain in this timeline. You sense his relief as each state's certification passes without the constitutional crisis many had feared. The chamber maintains its dignity as lawmakers debate within established norms, voices raised but not weapons drawn. By 4 p.m., you witness Pence declaring Joe Biden the certified winner of the 2020 presidential election. The moment passes with historic significance, but without historic trauma. Democracy functioning exactly as the founders intended. You watch Pence gather his papers, knowing that in another timeline, this day would have tested every principle he held dear. You find yourself in the gleaming headquarters of Twitter, watching content moderators stare at screens displaying an entirely different kind of January 6th. The algorithms designed to detect incitement and violence suddenly find themselves processing messages of grudging acceptance rather than calls for revolution. You observe the emergency protocols that were prepared for this day remaining unused. Crisis management teams standing down from high alert. Facebook's War Room, equipped with real-time monitoring dashboards, displays engagement metrics that trend toward political disappointment rather than dangerous mobilization. The automated systems that would have suspended thousands of accounts instead flag routine political complaints and standard election grievances. You watch as platform executives breathe sighs of relief, their worst-case scenario playbooks remaining closed on conference tables. YouTube's recommendation algorithms, previously primed to suppress inflammatory content, begin processing Trump's concession speech rather than stop the steal videos. The content moderation teams that had prepared for an unprecedented day of digital combat find themselves handling typical Wednesday political discourse. You witness how social media's response shapes public perception when the platforms aren't forced into emergency suppression mode. TikTok trends shift toward political commentary and memes rather than live-streamed chaos and calls for action. The digital ecosystem that might have amplified violence instead processes the peaceful transition of democratic norms. You realize that without inflammatory content to moderate, these platforms face different questions about free speech and political expression. You step into the smoke-filled backrooms of Republican Party headquarters, where party leaders grapple with an unexpected problem: what to do with Trump without martyrdom. The emergency conference calls that were prepared to manage post-riot damage control instead become strategy sessions about managing Trump's graceful exit. You watch as Mitch McConnell privately celebrates avoiding the constitutional crisis that would have torn his party apart for generations. Republican governors who had prepared statements distancing themselves from violence instead craft messages supporting constitutional processes. The party machinery that might have fractured between Trump loyalists and establishment figures finds itself unified around a peaceful transition narrative. You observe younger Republican politicians realizing they won't need to choose between condemning Trump or defending the indefensible. Senate Republicans breathe easier knowing they won't face an impeachment trial that would have divided their caucus irreparably. The donors who might have fled in horror at violent imagery instead continue their support, seeing Trump's concession as political maturity. You witness party strategists pivoting their 2022 midterm planning away from damage control toward traditional campaign messaging. Conservative media personalities who prepared to defend or denounce the riots instead focus on policy disagreements and electoral reform. The Republican National Committee meetings, scheduled for crisis management, transform into discussions about reclaiming conservative principles. You sense that without January 6th as a defining moment, the GOP's internal civil war takes a completely different trajectory. You stand on the steps of the Capitol as January 20th dawns crisp and clear, witnessing an inauguration that unfolds with traditional pageantry rather than fortress-like security. The National Mall fills with the usual inaugural crowd, their faces reflecting hope and political division, but not trauma or fear. You observe the Secret Service maintaining standard protection protocols instead of the unprecedented security measures that shaped another timeline. Biden's motorcade travels its planned route without the detours and armored precautions that would have been necessary after January 6th. The inaugural platform hosts the traditional gathering of former presidents, including Trump, whose presence signals democratic continuity rather than democratic fragility. You watch as Biden delivers his unity message to a nation that feels politically divided but not institutionally broken. The crowd's response reflects typical partisan reactions, rather than the cathartic relief of democracy surviving an attempted coup. Lady Gaga's national anthem performance resonates with patriotic tradition, instead of serving as a defiant declaration of democratic resilience. You witness the peaceful transfer of power occurring exactly as the Constitution intended, without the weight of recent trauma. The inaugural balls that evening celebrate American democracy as an ongoing project rather than a recently rescued institution. Media coverage focuses on Biden's policy agenda and political challenges rather than healing a wounded republic. You sense that this inauguration launches a presidency with normal expectations rather than emergency ones. You sit in newsrooms across America, watching editors and producers grapple with covering politics without the dramatic footage that would have defined coverage for years. CNN's breaking news alerts focus on policy disagreements and traditional political theater rather than constitutional crises and democratic backsliding. Fox News navigates the post-Trump transition without having to defend or condemn actions that never occurred, allowing more nuanced conservative commentary. You observe how cable news ratings reflect typical post-election audience patterns instead of the sustained crisis-driven viewership that trauma generates. The political talk shows that might have endlessly analyzed riot footage instead debate infrastructure bills and foreign policy challenges. Sunday morning news programs return to their traditional format of policy wonks discussing legislation rather than constitutional scholars explaining democracy's fragility. You watch as network news graphics departments shelve the democracy in crisis packages that were prepared but never needed. Social media discourse, without viral riot videos to share and analyze, focuses on more mundane political disagreements and policy debates. The 24-hour news cycle that might have been dominated by January 6th analysis instead covers Biden's cabinet appointments and early legislative agenda. You witness how political journalism evolves differently when reporters aren't processing collective trauma while covering the news. International media coverage of American politics shifts back to typical superpower analysis rather than "can American democracy survive?" narratives. The media landscape that emerges focuses on governance challenges rather than existential democratic threats. You find yourself in the offices of federal prosecutors who had prepared for the largest domestic terrorism investigation in American history, now redirecting their resources elsewhere. The Department of Justice Task Force, assembled to handle January 6 prosecutions instead, focuses on routine election fraud cases and standard political corruption investigations. You observe FBI field offices that had mobilized hundreds of agents for riot-related arrests, returning to their normal caseloads of organized crime and cybersecurity threats. The massive evidence collection operation that would have processed thousands of social media posts and cell phone videos never materializes. Court dockets in Washington, D.C. that might have been clogged with sedition trials instead handle typical federal cases and civil rights violations. You watch as legal scholars who prepared to debate the boundaries of incitement and insurrection instead discuss more mundane constitutional questions. The special grand juries that were impaneled to investigate the events of January 6th are quietly disbanded without issuing major indictments. Defense attorneys who had braced for representing hundreds of riot defendants find themselves handling standard white-collar crime and drug cases. You witness how the legal system's capacity, freed from processing a massive domestic terrorism event, addresses other pressing criminal justice priorities. The congressional investigations that might have consumed years of testimony and document review focus on routine oversight of executive agencies. Federal resources that would have been devoted to prosecuting insurrectionists instead target human trafficking networks and financial crimes. You sense that without January 6th cases to process, America's justice system follows its normal rhythm rather than extraordinary emergency procedures. You stand in polling centers across America, observing how public trust in democratic institutions evolves along a completely different trajectory. The Gallup polls that might have shown historic lows in confidence in Congress instead reflect typical post-election political dissatisfaction. You watch as surveys measuring faith in election integrity show standard partisan divisions rather than widespread institutional doubt. Town halls and civic meetings proceed with normal political disagreements instead of fundamental questions about democratic legitimacy. The civic education programs that might have focused on defending democracy instead continue teaching standard constitutional processes. You observe how younger Americans' political socialization occurs without January 6th as a defining moment of democratic fragility. Social trust metrics, measured by researchers studying American cohesion, show typical political polarization rather than institutional breakdown. The foreign policy implications of domestic political stability allow America to project strength rather than address questions about internal chaos. You witness how international allies respond to American leadership without concerns about democratic backsliding and institutional collapse. Public opinion research reveals that Americans debate policy priorities rather than existential questions about their system of government. The conspiracy theories that might have flourished in the aftermath of political violence instead remain marginalized fringe beliefs. You sense that democratic norms, stress-tested but not broken, emerge stronger through peaceful constitutional processes rather than survival of crisis. You sit in diplomatic briefing rooms across Europe and Asia, watching foreign leaders recalibrate their assessments of American political stability. The emergency NATO meetings that were scheduled to address questions about democratic backsliding in America instead focus on routine alliance coordination. You observe how China's propaganda apparatus, deprived of January 6th footage, struggles to craft narratives about American democratic weakness. European Parliament sessions that might have debated sanctions on American officials instead discuss standard trade and climate cooperation. The international media coverage that would have questioned American exceptionalism instead returns to typical superpower analysis. You watch as foreign intelligence services redirect resources from monitoring American domestic instability to traditional espionage priorities. International students and immigrants continue viewing America as a stable, democratic destination rather than a politically volatile nation. The diplomatic cables that might have expressed concerns about American democratic institutions instead report on normal policy disagreements. You witness how America's soft power projection remains intact without the damage that political violence would have inflicted. Foreign investment patterns show confidence in American political stability rather than hedging against institutional collapse. The global democracy indexes that rank governmental stability place America in its typical position rather than marking significant decline. You sense that international relations proceed with America as a reliable partner rather than a nation requiring careful monitoring of internal stability. You step into the West Wing during Biden's first 100 days, witnessing an administration that can focus on governing rather than healing national trauma. The daily press briefings address infrastructure legislation and vaccine distribution without constant questions about democratic institutions under threat. You observe how Biden's cabinet appointments proceed through normal confirmation processes rather than emergency measures to restore institutional credibility. The National Security Council meetings that might have addressed domestic terrorism instead focus on traditional foreign policy challenges and global competition. Biden's legislative agenda moves through Congress with typical partisan opposition rather than the existential urgency of democracy preservation. You watch as the administration's messaging concentrates on policy achievements rather than constantly reassuring the public about constitutional stability. The early executive orders address climate change and immigration without needing to restore faith in federal institutions. White House staff meetings discuss poll numbers and midterm strategy rather than damage control from domestic political violence. You witness how Biden's approval ratings reflect normal honeymoon period patterns rather than crisis-driven solidarity or backlash. The State of the Union preparation focuses on traditional policy priorities rather than addressing an attempted insurrection. International summits showcase Biden's experience and competence rather than serving as opportunities to reassure allies about American stability. You sense that this presidency begins with the luxury of normal political challenges rather than the burden of democratic restoration. You follow Trump into his post-presidency life, watching him navigate political relevance through completely different channels than martyrdom and grievance. Mar-a-Lago becomes a hub for conservative policy discussions rather than a fortress of resistance against alleged persecution. You observe Trump's media ventures focusing on traditional conservative commentary rather than claims of election fraud and institutional conspiracy. The rallies that might have centered on January 6th grievances instead promote standard Republican talking points about taxes and regulation. Trump's endorsements in local races carry typical incumbent influence rather than the weight of a persecuted political martyr. You watch as his social media presence, freed from platform suspensions, engages in normal political criticism rather than insurrection-adjacent rhetoric. The book deals and documentary projects that emerge tell stories of political achievement rather than democratic resistance and alleged victimization. Trump's legal challenges focus on routine business disputes rather than defending against sedition and incitement charges. You witness how his relationship with other Republican leaders evolves through standard political rivalry rather than loyalty tests based on January 6th positions. The Trump political organization that develops concentrates on 2024 electoral strategy rather than relitigating 2020 through the lens of violent resistance. Conservative donors who might have been torn between supporting or distancing themselves instead make typical calculations about political viability. You sense that Trump's post-presidency influence follows historical precedent rather than creating an entirely new category of disgraced but defiant former president. You walk the halls of Congress in the months following January 6th, observing how relationships between lawmakers develop without the trauma of shared violence. The Capitol Police continue their routine security operations rather than processing the psychological aftermath of defending democracy under siege. You watch as House and Senate members from opposing parties maintain typical adversarial relationships rather than the complex dynamics of attack survivors. Committee hearings proceed with standard partisan theatrics rather than the weight of investigating an assault on the legislative branch. The Capitol building itself remains a symbol of democratic governance rather than a site requiring extensive security upgrades and memorial considerations. You observe how congressional staff go about their daily work without the hypervigilance that would have followed a violent breach. Legislative sessions continue with normal procedural disputes rather than debates about the safety of democratic processes. The friendships and working relationships that cross party lines develop naturally rather than being forged through shared trauma. You witness how the institutional memory of Congress evolves without January 6th as a defining moment of democratic resilience or fragility. Speaker Pelosi's leadership focuses on advancing democratic priorities rather than managing the aftermath of an unprecedented attack. Republican members navigate their opposition role through traditional channels rather than grappling with complicity in violence against their workplace. You sense that congressional culture maintains its typical dysfunction rather than being fundamentally altered by collective trauma and survival. You step into Republican campaign headquarters as the 2022 midterms approach, witnessing how messaging strategies develop without January 6th baggage. The defensive talking points that might have addressed riot complicity instead focus on standard opposition themes of inflation and foreign policy failures. You observe how Republican candidates navigate primary elections without needing to declare their positions on the events that never occurred. The fundraising appeals that might have centered on persecution and grievance instead emphasize traditional conservative policy priorities. Democratic campaign strategies, deprived of January 6th as a rallying cry, concentrate on Biden's legislative achievements and standard progressive messaging. You watch as swing voters make decisions based on economic concerns and healthcare priorities, rather than questions about democratic institutions. The political advertisements that flood television screens debate tax policy and infrastructure spending rather than constitutional preservation. Polling data reflects typical midterm patterns of dissatisfaction with the incumbent party rather than existential concerns about democracy. You witness how candidate debates proceed with standard policy disagreements rather than fundamental questions about election legitimacy. The get-out-the-vote efforts on both sides focus on traditional partisan motivation rather than emergency appeals to save democracy. Election security discussions center on routine voting logistics rather than preventing future coups and insurrections. You sense that the 2022 elections unfold as a normal midterm referendum on governing performance rather than a test of democratic survival. You stand in constitutional law classrooms across America, observing how legal scholars discuss democratic resilience when stress tests don't result in breaking points. The emergency constitutional amendments that might have been proposed to prevent future insurrections remain academic exercises rather than urgent legislation. You watch as Supreme Court cases proceed with typical ideological divisions rather than fundamental questions about democratic legitimacy and electoral violence. Legal academic conferences focus on routine constitutional interpretation rather than crisis-driven discussions about institutional preservation. The precedents that might have been set by prosecuting insurrectionists instead remain theoretical discussions in law review articles. You observe how constitutional scholars analyze the peaceful transfer of power as a successful stress test rather than a near-miss catastrophe. Law school curricula continue teaching traditional separation of powers rather than adding emergency modules on defending democracy from internal threats. The constitutional crisis literature that might have flourished instead remains a specialized academic niche rather than mainstream legal scholarship. You witness how judicial nominations proceed through normal partisan confirmation battles rather than existential questions about court legitimacy. Federal court opinions address typical statutory interpretation rather than groundbreaking decisions about political violence and democratic norms. The legal profession's relationship with democratic institutions evolves through gradual reform rather than trauma-driven transformation. You sense that constitutional democracy emerges strengthened through successful navigation of political transition rather than survival of attempted destruction. You walk through American communities, observing how political culture evolves without January 6th as a shared national trauma that divided friends and families. The Thanksgiving dinner conversations that might have erupted into irreconcilable arguments instead feature typical family political disagreements. You watch as social media relationships strain over normal policy disputes rather than fundamental questions about democratic legitimacy and political violence. Local school board meetings proceed with standard education debates rather than becoming proxies for national battles about election integrity. The cultural divisions that might have hardened around January 6th narratives instead follow traditional patterns of political polarization. You observe How American civil religion continues its normal evolution rather than being shattered by images of violence in the Capitol. The conspiracy theories that might have flourished in the aftermath of political chaos instead remain marginalized fringe beliefs. Community organizations and civic groups maintain their typical membership patterns rather than fracturing along January 6th loyalty lines. You witness how American political discourse, while still polarized, avoids the complete breakdown of shared reality that violence might have triggered. The cultural memory of 2020 to 2021 centers on pandemic response and economic recovery rather than democratic crisis and institutional failure. National symbols and patriotic rituals retain their contested but stable meaning rather than being reinterpreted through the lens of attempted insurrection. You sense that American political culture maintains its troubled but functional characteristics rather than crossing into territory where democracy itself becomes negotiable. You enter state election offices across America, observing how electoral security discussions develop without the urgency of preventing future coups. The voting system upgrades that might have been implemented as emergency measures instead proceed through normal procurement and budgetary processes. You watch as election officials focus on standard challenges of voter registration and ballot processing rather than fortifying democracy against internal threats. The training programs for poll workers emphasize routine election administration rather than recognizing and responding to political intimidation. State legislatures debate voting rights and election procedures through typical partisan lenses rather than existential questions about democratic survival. You observe how voter ID laws and mail-in ballot policies are discussed as standard political issues rather than bulwarks against insurrection. The federal oversight of state elections continues its normal constitutional balance rather than emergency intervention to preserve democratic institutions. Election security funding focuses on cybersecurity and infrastructure rather than physical protection from domestic political violence. You witness how public confidence in electoral processes reflects typical partisan skepticism rather than widespread institutional doubt. The academic research on election integrity examines routine administrative challenges rather than preventing authoritarian capture of democratic processes. International election observers view American democracy as a stable system, with normal challenges rather than a fragile institution requiring monitoring. You sense that electoral security evolves through incremental reform rather than crisis-driven transformation designed to prevent democratic collapse. You stand at the crossroads of alternate history, contemplating how American democracy's trajectory shifts when institutional breaking points aren't reached. The stress test of January 6, 2021, reveals itself not as a near collapse, but as a successful navigation of political transition within constitutional bounds. You observe how democratic norms, when challenged but not shattered, emerge reinforced rather than requiring emergency repair and restoration. The counterfactual world you've witnessed shows institutions bending under pressure but maintaining their essential structural integrity. Political polarization continues its troubling trajectory, but without the catalyst of political violence to accelerate democratic breakdown. You watch as America's democratic experiment proceeds with its typical dysfunction, rather than crossing into uncharted territory of institutional collapse. The peaceful transfer of power occurs exactly as the founders intended, demonstrating that constitutional systems can withstand even their most severe tests. International observers note American democracy's resilience rather than its fragility, maintaining confidence in democratic institutions globally. You witness how the absence of political violence allows normal democratic processes to function, even amid deep political disagreement. The alternate timeline reveals democracy's capacity for self-correction when given the opportunity to operate within established norms. Future historians in this timeline will debate typical political failures rather than attempting to understand how democracy nearly died. You sense that American democracy, tested but not broken, continues its imperfect journey toward a more perfect union. As we reach the end of our alternate journey, you find yourself contemplating the profound fragility and resilience that coexist within democratic institutions. The timeline we've explored reveals how individual choices in moments of crisis can redirect the entire course of a nation's democratic experiment. You've witnessed how Trump's decision to concede, rather than resist, created ripple effects that preserved institutional norms and prevented democratic trauma. The absence of January 6th as a defining moment allowed American politics to continue its messy, polarized, but fundamentally constitutional trajectory. You've seen how democracy's strength lies not just in surviving attacks, but in never being attacked at all when leaders choose constitutional paths. The peaceful transition of power, occurring exactly as intended, demonstrated that the American system can work when participants respect its boundaries. This alternate reality reminds us that history's most significant moments are often the crises that never occur, the breaking points never reached. You've observed how the absence of political violence allowed normal democratic processes to function, even amid deep disagreement and polarization. The institutions you've watched, Congress, courts, elections, media, remained imperfect but functional, rather than requiring emergency restoration and repair. In this timeline, American democracy emerges not as a survivor of attempted destruction, but as a successful navigator of constitutional stress. So here's my question for you. In a world where January 6th never happened, would American democracy have been stronger or weaker in the long run? Would the stress test that never occurred have left institutions more vulnerable to future challenges? Or would the preservation of norms have created a more stable foundation? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below.